Well, this week we are talking with Kelly Lewis and Suzanne Woods Fisher, and we're talking about stories that influence us as we consider the narrative of foster care and adoption. We're talking about the concept of being chosen and belonging, being part of a community. And so we're going to continue our conversation today with these two guests.
For many years, adoption was primarily, and I would say almost exclusively, about babies.
Yep.
And the stories were the birth mother made some secret adoption plan. But then open adoption started to become popular, and then that was followed by international adoption, then transracial adoption, and now it's all kinds of adoption, which is wonderful. What's the next story in adoption and foster care, Kelly?
Well, I took this in a little bit different direction.
That's okay.
I would love to see a decrease in the need for foster care. And so for me, I think that involves the strengthening of the family as far as having, a mother figure and a father figure and a community supporting them. I mean, we hear so many stories about single mothers with 6 kids or 25 years old who haven't graduated from high school. How can you take care of 6 kids when you're 25 years old and don't have a job? And there's so many sad stories and there's so many similar stories out there. Yeah. There are some great programs out there. My home church, they're one chapter of a national organization called Safe Families for Children. And it's kind of an intervention before the kids are removed from the home. It's a step where they can get some help, they can get some relief, they can have someone come in and support them, either host the children for a while while they're getting their lives straightened out, or they can come alongside of a family and, give moral support. And I think that, if we could get our churches and our communities, it's a big idealistic idea to come around and to change the direction of this. Sure. I mean, it's just so sad. It's an ongoing thing. And adoption's a somewhat different story. But for me, that's kind of what I would love to see. Would love to see that. But
And we'll get that link and we'll put that in our show notes for that national organization. But, we all know that prevention is worth a pound of cure, right? So if we can prevent some of these things from happening in the foster system and giving people the tools they need, because I know in my experience as a teacher, I have grandparents raising their children, and that's a huge issue right now. And we have parents who've checked out and just are not available. We have an opioid crisis that makes parents unavailable. So we've got lots of issues that I think having some tools and resources would be helpful. I think that's a great idea.
Well, Suzanne, if you were writing a novel about foster care and adoption and you set it in the year 2030, how would it be different from Stitches in Time?
Okay, so if we're looking a decade ahead, and what I love Kelly's answer of really trying to hope that we don't have as great a need. I think right now there's about 500,000 children a year in foster care, which is so many. And the opioid crisis has just taken that to whole new levels. So if we're setting this in 2030, there's a premise that I actually took that's a decade behind us. If you look back in I think 2008, 9, 10, right on there was a little church in Texas, and the minister actually challenged his congregation to empty out the foster care system. And one by one, the families said yes. And now, even now, this is like 10 years after that had happened, there are more licensed families than there are children needing foster care in that county.
Wow.
That's
awesome. I
awesome.
love to see that, to see churches be the answer to this and supporting families like Kelly's and bringing this issue right to the forefront. And like Kelly, I live in a place that's rather homogenous, and we have to go kind of at ways to try to find more diversity. But I think that shouldn't be stopping us. We should be really pushing the boundaries and being the first one to answer that need.
I appreciate that.
That would be a fantastic novel, actually. If you're.
Yeah, that's what she said. That's the premise of her.
I see.
Yeah, it's exactly right. That's awesome. Well, we definitely want to promote that because that's something that I think for many of us, we just feel that strong push for that prevention. A lot of the things in our podcast, we've talked about tools and things that are preventative, where we've talked about even looking at some of the trends with children who are not represented in literature well and things like that, and bringing that to the forefront. And I think that's one of the gifts that we can provide through these mediums of story, being able to open eyes that maybe, I didn't even think about that. there aren't books that represent me. I need some of those options to see differently. So Suzanne, I appreciate that.
Yeah, I was just thinking about this. If do you remember when we had Matali Perkins and
Yes.
Samuel Parker on talking
Yes,
about
crossing
stories that
borders.
cross borders? I don't know. How many books are there for kids that have as their protagonist a child adopted by parents of a different race, or a child adopted by a single parent?
Yeah.
Or
There you go, Suzanne.
I don't know.
Okay, that's my next novel.
Except it needs to be
I appreciate that.
Except Suzanne, it needs to be a children's picture book. So you're going to have to work on that.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay.
You have to reduce your word count and your vocabulary.
And improve my little stick figure count.
There you go. Well, in 2013, there was an article that Mother Jones drew attention to the dark side of international adoption. Now, part of that was because Mother Jones hates religion. It gives them a chance to bash it. But part of their critique was on target. Some people have unwittingly engaged in human trafficking when adopting internationally with the best of intentions, but with unthinkable outcomes. And too often, we made the adoption story one of rescue from poverty and a bad country and a welcome to a good one. And now the Christian Alliance for Orphans and others are working hard to normalize and support foster care and adoption within developing countries such as Kenya and the Philippines. How can we help tell a better international story that encourages adoption and foster care, but doesn't necessarily involve an American? What do you think, Suzanne?
That's a really interesting question, because it is so true about children being trafficked who are part of this. In fact, even just in our country, I think the statistics are 60 to 80% of sex trafficked youth are foster youth.
Yeah. Yep. I can actually attest to that one. My daughter works in a sexual trauma nonprofit, and they have shared some of those statistics, and you're right on point.
Yeah, so I think there's some things, in fact, you mentioned a couple of good books. There's a number of other good books, too, When Helping Hurts and some things like that, where Americans think we're fixing the problems of the world. It's a great question. I guess it goes back to even a little bit of what Kelly was saying earlier of the preventative care and of keeping families whole and healthy. But I feel like probably one of the best way to try to help families who are struggling overseas is helping the women. And there's more and more organizations, and I'm so sorry, men, for saying this, but from what I understand, it's if you can help those moms, that money goes back to the family. But sometimes when organizations are going in and helping the men, and this is a sweeping statement, I'm probably going to get in trouble, but in a lot of countries, the money goes into drugs and alcohol. So I've been so impressed with organizations that are working to help build the mother's ability to have employment and gainful employment.
That's an excellent answer.
That is.
I don't know if that kind of jives with some of the things you've learned also.
It has. We had Belinda Bauman on talking about international trauma, and she shared stories of women and how when you help her, you have helped the community, and that trickle-down effect by supporting the woman. Yeah, for sure. I appreciate that. What about you, Kelly?
I don't know that I have much to add on the international side of it, but...
Okay, I do. Please do. No, it's just, I've lived abroad. I've lived abroad a couple of times. I did not adopt internationally, but I have friends who did, and it's a wonderful story, and who knows, maybe one day I'll do it. It better be one day soon, if I'm gonna age out here before long. But cultures have developed different ways of caring for unparented children over time. But urbanization and persistent poverty and post-colonial cultures and all of that has disrupted that.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And I know when I was growing up, and you just said you were something you'll get in trouble for, Suzanne, so I'll go ahead and follow your lead. When I was growing up in the Philippines, lots of kids were being raised by aunts, uncles, neighbors, grandparents, somebody, because their parents were working overseas or they had passed away or, just the whole stories that come about. But a lot of times those kids were more like the maid. We're going to adopt this little girl and we're going to say we've adopted her, but she's going to sleep with maid's quarters and she's going to work for her place in the family. unlike our children who are going to go to school. And I think one of the things that when I was researching for this episode that the Christian Alliance for Orphans and some of their member associations are doing is working with Filipino churches who are now taking the lead on this and saying, hey, that's not the way that adoption works. You know, when you make somebody a part of your family, they're an equal part of the family.
Right.
You don't get to like adopt a servant. You adopt a son or daughter. I think it's a marvelous thing to do and holds more promise for real transformation than international adoption does. Although, like I say, I may do that one day. But I just think it's a really neat idea. And I'd love to see a book around that sometime or some stories around that really capture people. Because we love those international adoption stories where, you know, a nice white person adopts poor children from another country. It'd be great if we saw some stories where people in those countries were really empowered and transformed their lives and their families too.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Okay, so speaking of aging out, let's talk about aging out of foster care. On Facebook, I follow Jimmy Wayne, the country musician and author of Walk to Beautiful, who grew up in foster care. And he's created a whole initiative around aging out called Meet Me Halfway, because the statistics on kids who age out of foster care are horrible when it comes to homelessness, substance abuse, trafficking, crime, incarceration. So how can we tell stories about this part of foster care and adoption in a way that encourages positive interventions, Kelly?
I think if we could help some of the older children, our home is licensed for age 2 to 18, basically, when we get our foster care license. When everyone wants a baby. Everyone wants from birth to 3.
Right.
When they hit 3 to 6, there's still a little bit more availability still. After 6, I mean, there's such a small amount of people that are willing to do that. And it is a big challenge. I'm not going to lie. Like, we've had a 10-year-old come into our home who they are very set in their ways and difficult to change their habits and stuff like that. And it can be very frustrating. I know there were several times during all of that I was, like, why, am I getting anywhere with this child? But now that she's out of my home and she calls me back and my words come out of her mouth.
Wow.
I'm like, she did hear me.
Yeah.
She really did hear me. Yeah. And so what I was getting at was, if we could have families that are willing to take on some of these older children and make them part of their family, not just age them out and send them on their way, but actually make the commitment, and I'm not there right now. That's not where I am either. But, we are willing to take a little bit older children. We said we want school-age children just for our lifestyle. I mean, we work and we need them to be in school during the day. Mm-hmm. But they also understand a lot more about their whole situation, which can be good and bad. But it's just an interesting story. And even with our little girl that we had that was adopted, the day that we were finding out about our new placement, I was having a lot of anxiety about this because we had agreed to do it. And I told them I was out of town on a 2-day trip. I wouldn't be home till Friday. I said, we can't get him until Friday. In the meantime, I was getting calls from the DSS worker about all these things that kept popping up. Well, we really think he needs to be in counseling. We really think he needs some intensive counseling. And I'm going, oh my gosh, what have I got myself into? Well, I hadn't heard from her in a few weeks. She texted me while I'm on this trip, fretting, distraught, so upset. And she's just like, checking in. Hey, Miss Kelly, how are you? And just this normal conversation that she could not have when she came to us. Wow. She could hold up her end of the conversation, which she could not do when she first came to us. Right. There's so much those kids can offer. And, to have them in permanent families and loving long-term relationships, I think that would help a lot.
Wow, I think that's a key. I'm hearing it from Holland. I hear it from you. It's just this idea of this loving compartment. It's part of a family, not a separate entity, but we're going to make you a part of our family. Mm-hmm. We're opening our hands up to include you. You're not this entity by yourself, and that has lasting effects. Mm-hmm. That's fantastic. So our signature question at the Afterword is, what is a metaphor to help us understand foster care and adoption? And Kelly, I'm going to give it to you first because I know you've had a little time to think about it, and Suzanne just got the question. So what do you think, Kel?
Okay. So as you mentioned in my introduction, I'm a horticulturist, so I grow plants. That's kind of my go-to. Yep. So I have my little plant metaphor. Hopefully this makes sense to you. So someone brings you this little small neglected plant. The ones I'm talking about, like the ones you see on the clearance rack. And someone has given it to them, and they have kind of, forgotten about it and left it alone for a little while, and they don't even know what it is. They kind of just bring it to you and say, I know you know something about plants. Do you think you can take care of this plant for me? And so you plant this little plant, you start feeding it and fertilizing it and watering it, and it's maybe has a few thorns on it that prick you every once in a while. You pull the weeds around it. It starts to grow bigger and bigger. That next year, you get a little fruit from it. It's a fruit tree. You have a little bit of fruit coming off that tree. And you think, if I keep pruning this tree and watering and fertilizing it, maybe next year I'll have even more fruit.
I love that.
So sure enough, you get some more fruit the next year. And then you're thinking, next year's going to be even better. And then you move away. So that's it.
Wow. But the fruit tree's still alive.
Yeah, and it's bearing fruit for someone else.
That's right.
Yeah.
So in that foster care metaphor, you have given life to a plant that was ready to be discarded. Oh, I love that. I love that. How about you, Suzanne?
Wow, how do I top that? Okay. Pretty impressive, Kelly. Okay, here's how I would like to leave and wrap this up, and it's with a visual of, I want you to picture a really still pond and you throwing a pebble or a rock in the middle of it, and it's just one, but the ripples, the effects of it, and the idea that we can make a difference, just one at a time, one step, like Kelly had said earlier, to get involved and find your fit. And there's so many different ways to do it. It can be prayer, all the way to actually fostering or even adopting a child into your forever family. Every person can make a difference on this issue that is really a crisis in our country and coming to the forefront. And so, like I mentioned earlier, so reflecting the heart of God to care for children because they are of great importance to Him, each one.
Well, you did something to help. You wrote Stitches in Time.
Oh, I wrote a story about this very topic, and it's about a church in the middle of Pennsylvania, an Amish church that tries to empty out the foster care system and bring children in. And the stories are fun because they're not just all ideal. There's all kinds of trouble and problems and things, and I try to be pretty realistic. And I've had some wonderful comments from families, kind of like Kelly, who have fostered and have experience, and they feel like it's a true picture of what it's like. And one said, my research shined, and I thought, oh, that made me so happy.
Yes. Well, then you have thrown that pebble in the pond and maybe made that ripple effect a little bit more to others.
So in addition to Stitches in Time, I'd like to recommend a couple of nonfiction books that people who are interested in adoption and foster care might want to pick up. The Connected Child is one, and Reframing Foster Care Through the Lens of the Gospel by Jason Johnson is another, along with Stitches in Time by Suzanne Woods Fisher.
Yeah. And we'll put links in our show notes as well, because we're going to be dropping this episode in December, which comes after World Orphan Day. Yeah. But we want to say thank you to Suzanne and Kelly. We appreciate you being with us. And a special thanks to our digital director, Jonathan Monroe. And
this is the final episode of Season 1 of the Afterword Podcast. Thank you so much for participating in our conversation. You've downloaded the podcast about 3,000 times since we launched 10 months ago. Season 2 launches January 18, 2020 with a podcast about comedy, humor, and storytelling with our guests, BBC comedy writer James Carey, who's worked on shows such as Miranda and Bluestone 42, and Harrison Brookie, the founder and executive director of the Alchemy Comedy Theater in Greenville, South Carolina. We have other great shows lined up for Season 2, including Stories from the Campaign Trail with campaign coach Deb Sofield and former state representative Phyllis Henderson, and Telling Your Business Story with Lubna Forsley Bader and Inc. columnist Robbie Abed. It's going to be the best season yet.
yes. And if you have not subscribed to the Afterword, please take a moment to do that. Then you will be up on all the latest Afterword information with links to fabulous guest resources and maybe some upcoming merchandise for 2020. As always, you are welcome at our table.